Out of all the big game conferences and conventions, the Game Developers Conference is the one I've found to be the most intimidating. If an abstract economy of sales figures, consumer trends, and investor demands form the backbone of the game industry, then an abstract network of forum posts, game reviews, and fan feedback form its soul. Following that metaphor, GDC is the game industry's brain. It's a massive, corporate-funded think tank where those abstract influences are taken into account. It's where developers criticize the present and the past, but most crucially, it's where those with power, the corporate executives, plan our futures. This isn't an event for fans. It's intended to be an event for professionals. It has a far smaller attendance count than E3 and PAX, and a far more expensive cost of admission. The cheapest pass is $150, and the most expensive all-access pass, an option either for the very rich or for businesses seeing it as an investment, is at least $2,000. And thanks to that high-price sponsorship paid from the revenues of nearly every major corporate player in games and its satellite industries, GDC is a well-oiled machine. The high production values of such an exclusive event are evidenced by its smooth logistics. Short lines, manageable crowds, slick slideshows, and an enthusiastic staff who somehow always find you a spot to sit in a crowded room. Another high-priced asset, evidencing just how much money this industry makes, is GDC's controversial location, San Francisco, a city that is simultaneously a hippie art house haven and a bastion of the status quo. The visible inequality of its homelessness problem and its rent prices strikes a chord with these game developers, who are now feeling that the massive amount of money earned by the game industry, evoked by the scale, scope, and slickness of an industry-funded event like GDC, is not trickling down into the well-being of people lower on the ladder, the rank-and-file developers who actually make these games. This year, GDC played host to 4 panels organized by Game Workers Unite, a pseudo-anonymous organization of people aiming to unionize the industry. It's another step I've noticed in an enduring effort from the event to appeal to the human interest, the underdogs of video gaming. Despite its corporate overlords, GDC and its 2 award shows are used to shine a spotlight on the efforts of independent developers, deceased developers, women and racial minority developers, and bizarre avant-garde experimental developers you probably wouldn't hear about anywhere else. And this year, that spotlight was turned towards unionization.
I am not anti-union, but I don't really think we need them, guys. I mean, we're doing fine, right? We're all great here and in this show, and no one here is union. Oh, God. That's right. Except for the lighting crew, I forgot they're all union.
Scott Benson, the illustrator behind Night in the Woods, is part of that unionization effort. What is Game Workers Unite, and why is it necessary in the current state of the industry and the economy?
Well, I'd say Game Workers Unite is a kind of industry kind of labor activist group. It kind of sprung into existence about a year ago, actually, at the last GDC. Kind of a ragtag group of people that really quickly, in response to an IGDA panel on, are unions a good idea for the industry, where it was clearly set up to just quash any sort of sentiment. A lot of people were like, well, we're going to be at GDC. Let's just all go to that panel and have that conversation. And it really took off from there. It was one of those things where we showed up with a logo, some stickers. That was my big contribution at the beginning, was designing the logo. Logo, some stickers, some pins, some really hastily put together zines and pamphlets. And it was just an avalanche going down the mountain. Immediately everyone was like, thank God someone has done something.
Why do you guys feel that game developers need union protection?
I think every industry needs union protection, right? So games aren't unique in that sense. It's not games out of everyone needs,
Well, it's software development.
Yeah, software development and
supposedly much more friendlier jobs outside of the game industry.
Yeah. Yeah, give or take a bit depending on where it is, but games are just kind of especially brutal in a lot of ways. The layoffs that you've probably heard about and talked about elsewhere, where a project will end and just, oh, we'll see you, you're all going home today, with just no warning, often no severance, and no sort of benefits after that. So games, like I said at the start, they're more extreme in some ways, the industry when it comes to this, but they're not unique. at all. Like the games industry likes to tell itself all the time that like, well, we're special, right? We're all here because we love it and we're a family and all this stuff. But like loads of industries say that, you know, and have that same sort of feeling.
It's just good marketing.
Yeah, before I got into games, I was doing motion graphics and post-production for film stuff, right? And I worked at a studio. I worked at a couple studios that did that, and it was the exact same thing.
Did they do crunch?
Yeah, and so when I got into this, you know, we're independent, but I have loads and loads of friends who work at studios, and they're talking about, like, yeah, we're going through this, and games are just weird, and I'm like, oh, that's exactly what I used to go through with the exact same terminology at this other place, right? So, like, sometimes they would just say, you have a deadline, my next Friday, stay until you get it done.
Overnight?
Yeah.
Wow.
God, at my old studio, the first 2 weeks I worked at the old studio, like it was a bunch of years ago. This wasn't a game studio, this is a motion graphics studio, but again, same basic thing. I didn't leave. I worked every day for 2 weeks and a bunch of overnights because I was terrified of losing my job, of not getting the job. And so there's that. Then there's like the whole thing of like, well, if I don't, I'm letting down like my team, right? Like I want to stay. And then there's also something where it's like, I've put my blood, sweat, and tears into this project. I want it to be really good.
I've heard plenty of stories about how crunch used to not be normal and how it kind of started to become the way it is around, I want to say mid-2000s to early 2010s. Do you know if the situation was always this bad, and if that has to do with why unionization is happening now rather than not earlier?
The issue of crunch was never this bad. It's gotten to kind of essentially breaking point, and the industry is starting to understand that, and people really are trying to be mindful and change that culture of crunch. But we've always had an issue of people working what's called founders hours, which just means like people throwing their all into stuff, right? Working late nights, working weekends. And I think that can be really wonderful. I'm definitely one of those people who likes to work myself to a breaking point and always wants to be chipping away at the work to be done. But I think the problem is we bring a lot of passion to this industry typically. People in the industry are often really, really invested in the work that they're doing, right? For us, it's often a dream job to be in this industry. And so sometimes we become incredibly open to being exploited for the sake of being in this industry. And so the issue of passion is kind of like a double-edged sword, right? We need to have passion and bring that level of excellence to our work every day, right? In order to make great games and build our communities and stuff, but we can't let that be a source of exploitation on the side of our bosses, who will use that, right? They'll use words like passion and motivate, like really personal kind of motivators, and calling the group a family instead of a company, and all of that's used to pressure people to overwork themselves, and often at the benefit of the company, and not necessarily either at the benefit of the product or the workers themselves.
That's the pseudo-anonymous Emma Kinema, whose Patreon-supported gig has her moonlighting as the closest thing to a spokesperson Game Workers Unite has. I'm assuming that Kinema is not your real last name, but you still have your face and your voice out there. I'm wondering why that is. That I can't say the same about the other interviews I've been doing.
The last year, and I've been doing kind of advocacy work in the industry and mild labor organizing before Game Workers Unite. And for all of that, I've been using essentially a pseudonym and not putting my face out there. Actually, I've kind of just recently decided to forego that. For a myriad of reasons. I feel like while that can certainly cause problems for my personal career prospects, I find that being really open and honest about my position on this, and being some sort of public voice for this, even though, of course, I can't speak for everyone. I would never even imagine or dream to, but I think it's really important to have people in the public who are willing to actually just own the fact that, yep, I'm pro-union. Yes, I believe that everyone deserves a dignified life at work. I believe workers should have democracy in their workplace. I believe that workers should have stabler, healthier conditions that allow them to live actual lives and build families and careers out of this industry. And I don't want to hide that behind anything at this point.
I wanted to ask about financing. If you wanted to get a strike fund together, how you would plan to raise that money. I see that you guys already have a Patreon campaign going, and is that something that you were going to look at further as crowdfunding options for running this union rather than the traditional buy a card and pay dues?
So there's actually a lot to break down in that. First off, Game Workers Unite doesn't actually have a proper funding source. Everything we do is self-funded with the people who do the organizing work within it. All of our actions, all of our travel expenses, all of our printing expenses, all of that comes straight out of our own pockets. I think the Patreon you're mentioning is my Patreon. It's a personal one for people interested in helping me support me in being a full-time organizer, because otherwise I can't afford it. I live paycheck to paycheck. And then in terms of your actual question about strike funds and dues and things, it's really important in a campaign of any scale, whether, again, you're organizing a coffee shop or a grocery store or a hardware store or a software worker's studio, right? You have to have a due structure, because without that, you have no financial cushion in case things go bad, in case the management really does take an offensive tack to it. And so dues provide that cushion in those kinds of situations, as well as also, of course, providing materials to print literature and host like events for the members of the union and things like that.
Also on the fringes of the industry, confident in their position and brazenly confident in their politics, is Ted Anderson of a studio called Pixel Pushers Union 512, which he describes as a worker-owned team that he hopes to eventually turn into an actual union. So to clarify on that, Pixel Pushers Union 512 is not an actual union, correct?
No, but we aspire to be. Like, that's the goal, is eventually for it to be either a part of Game Workers Unite or get recognized by another union eventually.
Before Pixel Pushers, did you work in the industry?
I've worked in the industry since 2001.
Oh, wow.
I've worked at small studios, independently run studios. I've worked at major studios, and there's different problems at every studio. There's good things at a lot of different studios too. I think that's something important to keep in mind, is that unions aren't always about grousing and complaints. They're about making sure that good studios stay good, and that you hold on to those good benefits and those good working relationships. But yeah, I've seen a lot of things change over the years, and one of those that has definitely changed is like a lot of benefits are just kind of going by the wayside little by little. We don't even talk about earning royalties anymore. Like, that's not even in discussion.
Did that used to be a thing?
Oh yeah. I have a house by and large because managed to sell pretty darn great. Royalties have gone by the wayside. Paid internships by and large have gone by the wayside. Extensive benefits have gone by the wayside a little bit. You're still seeing a lot of shops offering, full health, dental, vision, etc. But even then, you're starting to see that kind of get clamped a little bit.
What about crunch time? Have you seen a lot of that in your career?
Oh, gosh. Yes.
Okay. It's not starting off on a positive note.
Yeah, if you've ever seen the picture of the 1,000-yard stare guy, that's the face I just did. No, it's I joke, but it's bad. Like, I've seen crunch destroy marriages. I've seen it turn people into alcoholics. I've seen it give them health problems. You name it.
Like Anderson, most of the Game Workers Unite members who agreed to interview work far enough outside the AAA studios to afford to have their identities known. But much of the conversation and quotes attributed to GWU comes from anonymous developers who fear that they'll be fired and blacklisted for talking about unionization. What about the pressure of fearing that your team would get laid off at the end of projects? Is that something your studio has had to deal with?
It's weird. The bigger company I've been at, that's basically just their MO in terms of QA.
Oh.
The way it works is that if you get into a larger studio, let's say 100, 200 employees or workers, they don't keep QA around the whole production period. What they basically do is that as they start to get to alpha, beta, they start hiring a bunch of QA who they pull from temp workers or just anyone who's interested in serving as QA. They pay them really low. They're probably going to get the brunt of crunch if the production ever comes to that. Once the game is shipped and there's just like a certain amount of like post-launch support, then QA is basically told, hey, your contracts expire, at this date. So see ya. The place I was at, the QA department was probably, I want to say like 60 to 80 people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that just happens like every cycle when that studio puts out a game.
How long is a cycle?
Depends on the game, but for that specifically, it was the cycle is 2 years.
And you said this was the MO at a lot of the bigger studios?
Oh yeah. As far as I've heard from a lot of these places, QA is, it's not something that's seen as like necessary to keep the whole way through. It's basically just needed towards the end. That
was actually another thing I was looking at there, is that this is happening to QA. I had previously assumed it was just the major dev staff.
I think when we're talking about a lot of layoffs here, when they're like seen as like newsworthy, it is typically when it affects the upper tier of like devs, your designers, programmers, artists, audio people, etc.
Right.
But this happens like clockwork at some places like every 2 years or every 3 years, because that's just how they do it. And it's part of the business model. Basically, functionally it is a layoff. It's just not seen as newsworthy or not reported on.
It's uncommon to hear news stories break of layoffs among QA departments in particular, but it's become increasingly common to hear news of it happening across entire studios. Last September, 250 Telltale employees were unexpectedly laid off when investors wouldn't support the studio's latest projects. After that, 800 employees were laid off by Activision Blizzard in February, shortly after one of their executives personally received a $15 million gift in stock and cash. This was days before 143 jobs were slashed off from ArenaNet. While I was there at GDC doing these interviews in March, Electronic Arts was laying off 350 people, and it's hard to gauge how many more similar stories will break shortly after this very video's publication.
So the thing is that like when that happens, basically the whole studio is focused just on that one title, and then it swaps to like the other studio's turn.
So they're not multitasking.
Right. So there's basically nothing for QA to move to in that type of organization.
So what's the bulk majority of of game companies doing between production on major releases? Are they just empty because they're not hired?
I mean, that's sort of what I'm trying to figure out.
All of these stories of massive layoffs from the past year also accompanied stories of weeks, if not months or years, of development schedules submerged in excessive overtime, aka crunch. A 2017 developer survey found that over half its respondents experienced crunch, with only 37% of them receiving additional compensation for their additional time. Clearer stories behind those numbers arose with reports of 12-hour days, 6 days a week at Sega, employees getting fired for refusing to work weekends at Epic Games, and, what was arguably last year's biggest scandal, 100-hour work weeks at Rockstar Games during the development of Red Dead Redemption 2, which itself was history repeating from a crunch time scandal that followed the release of Red Dead Redemption 1 nearly a decade ago.
Even the way that crunch is handled has changed a lot over the tenure of my career. So initially, crunch happened because people screwed up. It wasn't planned. You would be in crunch because the inevitable sales season of September to November was fast approaching, and for a variety of reasons, the game wasn't in shippable shape yet, or last minute additions have been made to the game, or a feature was a lot harder to implement than previously planned. Any number of things can go wrong, or someone just figured that the game would be done a lot quicker than it actually was. You saw some really bad stuff, especially in the early 2000s, because I think that a lot of studios were still able to pull off that passion argument pretty well, and the industry was still a lot of relatively young folks, and I was one of them. There was a time in my life where like I could just go, and staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning and working on a game. It wasn't going to kill me, but it would not be pleasant.
Crunch, which is long periods of overtime work. It's kind of a chronic issue in the industry. It used to be kind of like a emergency stopgap type of thing, wherein production was going awry. Nowadays, studios tend to plan on it.
And now it's apparently normal.
Yeah, now we've just gotten used to the thing, unfortunately.
Crunch time is often explained by bosses as being voluntary, despite employees clarifying that, with their careers at stake under the pressure of professional expectations, a boss's request to clock in for excessive overtime hardly feels voluntary at all.
So have you experienced that personally in your career?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'm a fairly young worker, but I've certainly seen my fair share of crunch already. I've also, experienced 2 layoffs now, a studio closure. This stuff is really common. You can be in the industry for a year and still experience some of these things pretty quickly.
And all of this can work together with overt
pressure
or kind of like sort of cultural pressures to make people work unbelievably long hours, and it leads to a culture of that. So it's not like one person who's like, yeah, I just decided this weekend or something. It becomes kind of a norm that other people are expected to do it, and you start feeling bad about it. And sometimes you will worry that you're going to lose your job and be replaced with someone else who will do that.
It's something that I low-key used to worry about when I was a younger man, but now that I've got a family and kids and a house, layoffs scare the hell out of me. So I don't want the younger generation of developers to grow up with that fear.
All units on bank raid progress, Bank of Liberty join count. Get us out of here.
Since at least 15 years ago, we used to talk about video games growing up in terms of them tackling mature subject matter. What we often don't talk about are game developers themselves growing up. And the survey numbers support that assumption. Despite the game industry entering into its 40s, most game developers are far younger. While previous generations of professional developers might have been more content to get out of the industry and change to other software development jobs, the 1980s brought about a generation of kids who grew up with games in their homes, as a seemingly permanent institution of entertainment existing since before they were born. This is a generation that sees game development inextricably linked with software development, as the most practical expression of software development, and games as a fundamental means of artistically expressing themselves as humans. And as this generation passes through its 30s, it's starting to have to maintain families. The financial stakes are getting higher, as the long-term sustainability of video game careers has become more established.
There's some real core issues going on here, and we can pass around job lists. People can sue their employers over specific issues, right? There's lots of little things we can do to support one another, but these are all essentially band-aids, just kind of hoping to pave over some of the symptoms of a larger root cause, and the larger root cause being actual exploitation by management of the workers, a lack of democratic control of our games and how we make them. And just the absolute toxic work culture that we deal with in this industry, which leads to an average of 5 to 6 years of burnout rate where people leave the industry after 7 years and never come back.
Has there been a big strike in video games before? Not speaking of the voice actors.
Yeah, I definitely actually would cite the voice actors as a great example of collective action in the industry, because voice actors work in this industry, right? They are people who work on games. And to me, those are people who represent the labor history and context of this industry. They set the ground for us. And unfortunately, game workers weren't in a position during the 2016 voice actors strike to be in a position to really support people and build active solidarity with them. And so they've really done a lot of work to lay a healthier foundation for us as people wanting to improve the lives of workers.
"50 years ago, almost 1 in 3 U.S. workers belonged to a union. Today, that number is more like 1 in 10. The largest and most powerful unions nowadays mostly cover the public sector: teachers, firefighters, and police. But even as their power shrinks, at least one unionized industry continues to hold its sway. Hollywood entertainment, which, just like the modern video game industry, started out as driven by passion. Movie studios were called dream factories. At the turn of the 20th century, demands for jobs in the movies was high. And as a result, just like in video games today, if you weren't a star, it was likely you were underpaid, overworked, and easily replaced by an industry whose studio leaders pursued vertical integration, the purchasing of all smaller companies lower in their supply chain, including your local theaters. The sometimes bloody back-and-forth process of organizing the labor of Hollywood began with the creation of the Motion Picture Producers Association in 1916 to combat government censorship. In 1927, the exclusive and glitzy Academy Awards were created, partially to get professionals competing against each other rather than their bosses. Half a decade later, when thousands of these jobs were in jeopardy at the end of the silent era, the talent guilds for directors, writers, and screen actors came onto the scene, complicating the relationships between Hollywood's union leaders, their bosses, and the mobsters who played both sides. First, studio bosses with mob connections would have hired thugs physically beat strikers. Later, after the end of Prohibition, mobsters found a new racket, infiltrating into unions, muscling their way into leadership roles, and intimidating studio bosses into lucrative personal payoffs. Strikes were common throughout the Great Depression, coordinated by a dizzying alphabet soup of rival organizations of varying repute. Groups like the CSA, the CSU, the SMPID, the IATSE all didn't agree on a lot of things, but they all did endure allegations of communism during the decades following the nation's first Red Scare. The only thing that put all that tumultuous momentum on pause was a nearly apocalyptic global total war. During World War II, the nation's key labor leaders had promised President Roosevelt that they would not strike during the war, and nearly everyone employed in entertainment had their dreams put on pause and their jobs refocused towards the war effort. Animators found themselves making political cartoons, editors were touching up spy photography, and the big studios were given big government contracts to make propaganda. But when the war ended and Hollywood workers found that their bosses didn't want to go back to the way it was, they demanded it, with half a decade's worth of pent-up aggression. The largest strikes in American history occurred in 1946, when 5 million workers picketed across the nation across different industries to all demand a return to the wages and negotiations they enjoyed during peacetime.
Railroad management representatives also seek to avert the strike, which costs the nation's carriers $25 million daily in lost revenue. The wheels of the country's railroads grind slowly to a halt as 250,000 trainmen and engineers walk off the job.
One of these strikes, among set decorators in Hollywood, turned violent. Cars were overturned by strikers, while strike breakers beat people with chains, hammers, and pipes. Warner Brothers threw tear gas into the crowds from the roofs of buildings. And amidst the figures orchestrating these strikes was, believe it or not, Ronald Reagan, president of the Screen Actors Guild.
The iron fist has a glass jaw.
Speaking at a conference shortly after implementing the residual payment system still used in Hollywood to this day, Ronald Reagan said, "Everyone here realizes that the one hope for progress and a liberal outlook in America and social gains and social welfare depends on organized labor. Here is all of labor, shoulder to shoulder and side by side, exactly the way it should be." Despite this, the victories of 1946's especially violent strikes gradually came to backfire. The violence of those strikes prompted Congress to pass the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. Its hearings showed the nation that American lawmakers were going to equate any organized labor efforts to communism, and the Act's new laws limited the power of unions to strike quickly and decisively. This is why higher tech industries younger than the 1950s tend to have a lot less unions around them than relics from prior centuries. But behind the scenes, the inner workings of the movie industry were still not appealing. In her 1949 book, anthropologist Hortense Powdermaker describes the Hollywood studios as combining a bungalow and a factory in their appearance. Many give the feeling of being temporary. But it's a landmark Supreme Court ruling from around that same time, the United States versus Paramount Pictures in 1948, that ended up making much of the modern movie economy as we know it today. After the court found that Paramount and the other Big Five studios were engaging in price-fixing conspiracies to monopolize the theater market, they broke those companies up away from their theater subsidiaries, which sure did end up decreasing production budgets, but not in the dramatically destructive way the defendants warned. The financial model of the industry turned from studios churning out as many mid-budget movies as possible to fill up their theaters, to studios churning out a lot of low-budget mass demographic movies to support one or two big-budget movies, all of which were intended to be more valuable choices for the newly independent theaters to pick and choose from. And these are the economic conditions that ended up stabilizing the power of the creative guilds in Hollywood for decades to come. The unions that existed before Taft-Hartley, and the regulations that existed after US v. Paramount Pictures. These are the conditions that led to the epic blockbuster. These conditions led the careers of the next generation of kids like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who would grow up reimagining the cheap thrills of lengthy big-budget effects movies as immersive, convincing, and fast-paced emotional tours. They were among the first to grow up with film as a decades-old, seemingly permanent institution of entertainment that existed since long before they were born. Unlike previous generations of celebrity directors who worked their way up from menial assistance jobs, they spent their young adulthood in film schools. They entered into a job market that was much less risky than it was 40 years earlier. They could at least expect to get a well-paying, long-lasting, good union job out of the dream factory. And the revenue generated by their high-tech, cutting-edge blockbusters leveraged down to the crew. More special effects artists meant more jobs, trickling into the ever more expensive budgets for the increasingly complex, increasingly digitized, inconveniently safer, and far more permanent production sets of today. But since the end of the Cold War in 1991, much of that progress has reversed. As the incentives offered to people change, people sometimes change. The politics of 1980s Ronald Reagan hardly resembled those of 1940s Ronald Reagan. And thanks to the deregulation and trickle-down economic policies of his presidency, vertically integrated monopolies that were broken up earlier in the century, like Standard Oil, have slowly rebought themselves and become mega conglomerates once again, like ExxonMobil. It's quite possible that movie studios will once again be allowed to own movie theaters. Despite their inability to stop the return of vertical integration, the unions of Hollywood still hold strikes to protect their workers. Two recent examples being strikes held by television writers in 2007 and by video game voice actors in 2016, both of which ended with workers receiving benefits higher than the previous norm but lower than their demands. In Hollywood, unionized workers who are already signed onto scripted gigs still get to work their jobs if a strike breaks out. But between projects, and while striking, they enjoy healthcare and pension plans protected by the unions and partially funded by union dues. If a film tanks at the box office, that's the studio's problem. Its workers will still be paid a livable wage regardless, thanks to this century-long process of introducing and protecting ever more specialized talent into the business. The credible threat of most of that productivity grinding to a halt during a strike is a very real one. Movies are an industry that has existed for over a century, and after all that time, it still remained a lucrative, appealing, and romantic one. The proof of their struggle is in the pudding. Despite all of this, people are still watching feature-length movies in movie theaters, just like our great-grandparents were doing 100 years ago. Will video games last a century? Will this kind of entertainment still be appealing to kids in the 2070s? Is following the Hollywood model a way to secure that stability for the future? If anything, what this history tells us is that stability is hard-won, and someone's hands are bound to get dirty in the process.
Has there been a strike in the game industry?
There have been in France. France has...
of course, France.
France will just, kidnap your boss or something.
Wow.
That's just, I think that happened recently, where, they just straight up kidnapped someone in management. It was funny. But, it's it's a little extreme, but, bosses in, that's nothing compared to the danger that workers themselves are in. Throughout history, they just have the workers shot. So, getting kidnapped occasionally isn't that big a deal.
Last but not least, I was wondering if I could get some of your responses to the perceived downsides of union.
Sure.
Do you think this might make it harder for younger people earlier in their careers to get their foot in the door of an already competitive industry?
No, I really don't. And the reason why I say that is because, there are actual studies that show this, that the amount of money, the amount of wage increase you get from union representation more than covers for how much money you would be putting into the union itself.
If unionization creates a slower turnaround time to ship products and increases video game budgets even further, because this is an industry where you're already looking at like 3 to 4 years to ship a blockbuster
We're a tiny
product.
game, and we're a tiny studio. It's multiple years to.
Yeah, games take a while to put out. They're also absurdly expensive, and the thought of increasing those costs further is something that I imagine a lot of bosses don't like to hear.
Yeah. Well, I would say that you could really decrease company costs by decreasing executive compensation.
And I wanted to expand upon the job market becoming more limited. Would that actually consolidate the power of the existing AAA powers and make it harder to compete with them and shake up the status quo?
That's really interesting. Can I ask, I just haven't been asked this question before, so it's really interesting to me. When you say consolidation of the AAA industry, what do you mean in particular? Like the consolidation of what?
The consolidation of jobs in a list of, say, top 5 or top 10 employers, comprised of people who don't leave and gradually grow out of touch with their markets and their consumers, but end up dominating the market anyway because they have enough capital to fake it till they make it.
I mean, that's already occurring in the industry, at least as far as I can tell. Like, there's definitely plenty of companies that, just rest on their laurels and cash in the check every month, right? I think the more tangible thing that might happen out of unionization, and if it becomes a fairly common thing in the industry, I think you'll see people not wanting to join certain companies if they aren't union because they'll have worse benefits and pay and worse hours, right?
Last but not least, what has had you deciding that unionization is the best way to tackle these problems?
You got a better plan?
I don't.
Well, that's kind of the thing. It's like there's kind of like the worker organization. That worker organization is like the only leverage you have, together, because it's like, what's your other options? Like, I guess you could quit.
Is making that kind of a holistic effort, is that why you feel unionization is the best option you guys have right now versus class action lawsuits?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So I mean, yes, ultimately yes, because, this industry is constantly racked with cycles of layoffs, right? We get it every couple of weeks, if not sooner than that. Whole studios close pretty dang regularly.
It isn't that, we're a bunch of grumpy people over here. I mean, we have our grievances, but we love making games. Like my wife always jokes that I work all day making games, and then I come home and I work on games. And the reason why I come home and I work on, stuff like Tonight We Riot is because, man, I love this business. I love making art. I love making worlds for people to explore. And I want to be able to do that without fear or stress. So I think that's not too much to ask.
All across the world, more and more people are experiencing that need to make games. This deep passion for exploring themselves by exploring interactive entertainment. Last year, we finally saw games from Africa be recognized at the Indie Game Festival. GDC may be the most intimidating video game event of the year, but it's also one of the most open-minded. Elsewhere on the show floor is a section called Alt Control GDC, which showcases games with inventive and unconventional control methods. Games that will likely only ever exist as cumbersome installations on show floors, not intended to ever be mass-produced, distributed, and sold. It is here that you can find the developers that most evoke what Ted Anderson was talking about. People who feel a craving for human expression through games. People who feel there is no other outlet for these kinds of messages. One of them is Alastair Aitchison, developer of The Book Ritual, a game in which players self-reflectively write wishes, desires, or regrets on the pages of books they then throw into a shredder. For some reason, for some sort of higher cause, never to be seen again.
So this big cardboard box here is inside that lovely creature is just a £30 Amazon Basic shredder, but I've got taped to it an Arduino board, and connected to the Arduino board are infrared light beams and infrared sensors. So when a paper comes through the top, it breaks the sensor at the top, and when it goes out the bottom, it breaks the sensor at the bottom. So when both of the beams are being stopped, what it will do is send some keyboard signals, just some button presses, through a USB cable it's just running off of a Mac Mini, and that will be detected by the game as something being shredded. So the book, the player chooses a book and it talks to them through the screen, and it's sort of kind of personified as a character. So it becomes a character and it talks to them, and it wants them to write inside of it and draw inside of it and do kind of creativity exercises, deleting words and things, but it also needs them to tear pages out of the book and put them through a shredder. So for me, it's quite a personal project for me. I wanted to talk about grief and loss. It was something that I was finding difficult to put into words in other ways, and I found that like making something that people could participate in, it kind of felt like I could get across those ideas that I was struggling to get across otherwise. In particular, like that process of tearing apart a book. You tear something out, you put it through the shredder, that's something irreversible, but it's something that you have to do to move forwards. And I wanted players to kind of actively feel that sensation, that perhaps a pang of guilt, or perhaps it could be a sort of sense of release, but it is engaging with that physical act of losing something permanently. That book will never be the same again, but I guess my hope is that by the end of the story they'll have turned it into something new. It's one of these kind of games that's very hard to experience outside that setting, because alternative controller games, it's very hard to experience them at anything other than an exhibition. But it's okay that actually, in a way, I'm not bothered that doesn't exist, because I don't know, I just needed to make the game. That's all there is to it. I just needed to make it.
People like Alastair would not have existed 20 years earlier. There's a reason this is his art. A formative reason created by the assumptions he would have made during his formative years, when gaming became mainstream and growing up to make games became a viable option. And like kids who grew up watching movies through the 50s, anyone born today will be growing up with a video game industry that will be, at minimum, 4 decades old. The question for the future, and the question this unionization effort will answer, is what kind of jobs this messy conflict is going to make available for those kids 18 years in the future.